Imagine this. The year is 1721. Boston. A port city buzzing with trade, faith, and fear. Ships arrive from distant shores, carrying not just goods, but death. Smallpox, the scourge of the age, spreads silently through crowded streets, burning through households, leaving scars and graves in its wake. In just a few weeks, the city feels like it is under siege, not from an enemy army, but from an invisible killer. This is the story we think we know. Colonial doctors battling disease with courage, ministers praying for salvation, a society scrambling to survive. But hidden inside this crisis was a voice, quiet, enslaved, and almost forgotten. An African man named Onesimus. His knowledge, carried across the Atlantic from his homeland, contained the seed of a solution. A method so bold, so controversial, that it would divide Boston, provoke outrage, and ultimately save lives. Yet for centuries, his name was buried beneath the accolades given to others. This is not just the story of a medical breakthrough. It is the story of how African knowledge shaped American survival, and how history almost erased the man who made it possible. And as we tell this story, we have to ask, why do we remember Cotton Mather and Zabdiel Boylston, but not Onesimus? What does that say about whose knowledge we value and whose we choose to forget? To understand Onesimus's contribution, we need to step back into the world of early 18th century Boston. It was a city of contradictions, deeply religious, yet dependent on slavery, fiercely proud yet fragile in the face of epidemics. The Puritans who had crossed the ocean seeking God's protection still lived in constant dread of disease. Smallpox had already struck New England several times, and each outbreak left behind a trail of grief. By 1721, Boston was home to roughly 11,000 people. Its narrow streets and wooden houses made it vulnerable. When smallpox arrived that year, it swept through with terrifying speed. Families closed their doors, ministers warned of God's wrath, and physicians could do little more than bleed the sick or prescribe herbs. This was the context into which Onesimus's voice emerged, a voice carrying a practice that had already saved lives for generations in Africa. When we picture Boston in 1721, it's easy to imagine its ministers standing at pulpits, shaping the minds of their congregations. Among them was Cotton Mather, one of the most influential figures of Puritan New England. He was respected, feared, and often controversial. Known for his role in the Salem witch trials decades earlier, Mather was a man both of science and superstition, constantly torn between faith and reason. But inside his household was someone whose presence rarely entered the official records: Onesimus, an enslaved African man given to Mather as property around 1706. Even the act of receiving Onesimus was recorded in Mather's diary as though he were an object, not a human being. Yet Onesimus was no ordinary servant. His name meant useful in Greek. A cruel irony, perhaps, but one that history would vindicate. In the daily grind of service, Onesimus quietly carried with him the memory of a medical tradition from across the Atlantic. He belonged to a continent that Europeans often dismissed as uncivilized. Yet that same continent carried centuries of accumulated knowledge about survival, healing, and disease. At some point, historians debate exactly when, Onesimus revealed to Mather something extraordinary. He explained that in his homeland, when smallpox threatened, people practiced a form of protection. They would take a small amount of material from an infected person, scratch it into the skin of someone healthy, and then, after enduring a mild sickness, that person would be safe, immune. This practice, today known as inoculation, had been known in parts of Africa for generations. It was not magic, not superstition, but observation turned into science. Onesimus himself bore the marks of this procedure, and he tried to describe to Mather how it worked. For Cotton Mather, the idea was radical. To deliberately introduce a disease into someone's body went against everything European medicine of the time believed. But Mather was fascinated. He questioned Onesimus, tested the idea against other reports, and realized that here, in his own household, was a potential answer to Boston's greatest fear. Still, the irony is hard to miss. Onesimus, an enslaved man, had knowledge that could save a city, yet he had no freedom, no platform, no authority. He had to entrust his words to a man who owned him, hoping they might be heard. How many other voices, how many other lives, carried wisdom that never escaped the chains of silence? Mather seized upon Onesimus's revelation, but ideas alone do not change societies. They must be tested, proved, and defended. That task would fall to another figure, Dr. Zabdiel Boylston, a physician bold enough to take Onesimus's knowledge and risk everything, even his own family, to show the world that it worked. Boston in 1721 was not a place that easily embraced new thinking. Ministers thundered against blasphemy, physicians clung to tradition, and the public lived in fear of anything that seemed unnatural. Enter Zabdiel Boylston, a local doctor, not the most celebrated but determined, practical, and willing to take risks. When Mather approached him with Onesimus's account of inoculation, Boylston faced a choice: dismiss it as dangerous nonsense, or test it in the real world. The real world, however, was unforgiving. Smallpox raged through Boston that summer, striking every neighborhood, sparing no social class. Panic ruled the streets. Many physicians insisted the only proper response was prayer, isolation, and bleeding, a practice more likely to weaken patients than save them. To propose deliberately infecting someone with smallpox sounded like madness. But Boylston listened. He trusted his instinct. And perhaps, deep down, he recognized the quiet power in the knowledge carried by Onesimus. And so, in June of 1721, he made a decision that would change medical history. Boylston began with the most intimate test possible, his own family. He inoculated his young son and 2 enslaved men in his household. Imagine the weight of that choice, to risk his child's life based on an African method most colonists dismissed as barbaric. If it failed, he would be remembered as a reckless fool, or worse, a murderer. But it worked. The 3 endured fevers, rashes, and discomfort. But they survived. Their sickness was mild, controlled, and temporary. When exposed to the full force of smallpox, they did not fall. They lived. Encouraged, Boylston extended the practice to others. One by one, patients underwent inoculation, endured the controlled illness, and emerged with immunity. It was not without risk. Some did die, as was true of the procedure even in Africa. But compared to the raging mortality outside, the numbers spoke for themselves. Inoculation saved lives. And yet, instead of gratitude, Boylston and Mather were met with fury. Many Bostonians saw inoculation as playing God, a reckless tampering with nature. Angry mobs threatened Boylston. At one point, a grenade was even thrown into Cotton Mather's house, with a note, "You dog, damn you." I'll inoculate you with this, with a pox to you." That was the climate of fear and hostility surrounding this medical revolution. Still, Boylston persisted. He continued to inoculate hundreds, carefully recording the results. And slowly, painfully, the evidence grew undeniable. Those who underwent Onesimus's method had far better chances of survival than those who faced smallpox unprotected. Think about what was happening here. The knowledge of an enslaved African man, passed to a minister, tested by a doctor, now stood at the center of a city's survival. Yet at every turn, that knowledge was contested, ridiculed, and nearly silenced. It survived only because someone was willing to trust it, even when it seemed impossible. By the end of 1721, Boston was scarred, but not destroyed. The epidemic had raged for months, killing more than 800 people, nearly 1 in every 10 residents. But among those who underwent inoculation, the survival rate was strikingly higher. Boylston's careful notes revealed the truth. Inoculation worked. And yet, victory did not feel like triumph. Instead, the controversy only deepened. Ministers argued bitterly from their pulpits, declaring that inoculation was an affront to God's will. Rival doctors accused Boylston of being reckless, dangerous, even murderous. Ordinary citizens whispered in fear, wondering if these experiments would doom the whole city. Boylston himself was forced into hiding for weeks, fearing for his life. Cotton Mather, though intellectually convinced of inoculation, was vilified as a meddler who dared to trust the word of an African over the wisdom of European tradition. The bitter irony was this: the same practice that saved lives also exposed Boston's deepest fears, prejudices, and resistance to change. But the most bitter irony of all? Onesimus, the man who carried the knowledge in the first place, disappeared from the narrative. His role was minimized, dismissed, or ignored. In Mather's own writings, Onesimus's testimony is acknowledged, yes, but quickly overshadowed by the names of ministers and physicians who debated its morality and tested its success. Over the decades that followed, histories of the 1721 epidemic celebrated Boylston as the pioneer of inoculation in America, with Mather credited as the intellectual who introduced the idea. Onesimus became a footnote at best, his name buried in the margins of medical history. Why? Because Onesimus was enslaved. His humanity, let alone his intelligence, was denied by a society built on bondage. To acknowledge him fully would mean admitting that African knowledge had saved the very colonists who claimed Africans were inferior. And that was a truth Boston, and later America, was not ready to face. And so, erasure became its own epidemic. The story of inoculation was retold again and again, but always from the perspective of those in power. The minister, the doctor, the city. Never the enslaved man whose quiet words carried the cure across an ocean. How many other Onesimuses were there in history? Men and women whose knowledge, culture, and traditions shaped the world. Yet whose names were silenced because of the color of their skin or the chains they were forced to wear. How often do we celebrate the result while forgetting the source? The truth, as always, cannot be buried forever. The echoes of Onesimus's contribution live on, not only in Boston's survival, but in the global story of vaccination itself. That seed of knowledge did not stop in Boston. Word of inoculation spread, debated and resisted at first, then slowly gaining ground. By the time Edward Jenner introduced vaccination with cowpox in the late 18th century, The world was already primed by the idea that immunity could be taught to the body, that deliberate exposure could prevent devastation. Without Onesimus, without Africa, the road to Jenner and beyond might have been longer, harder, or even unimagined. Smallpox, once the terror of continents, was declared eradicated in 1980, the first disease humanity successfully wiped from the face of the earth. Every step of that journey, from the first controlled scratch on the skin in Boston to the global campaigns of the 20th century, carries Onesimus's fingerprints. And yet, for centuries, his name was missing. It is only in recent decades that historians have begun to recover his role, to acknowledge that the roots of vaccination are not solely European, but also African. That the survival of Boston in 1721 was not just the triumph of doctors and ministers, but also the triumph of knowledge carried by a man who was never meant to be heard. Think about the irony. The very society that enslaved Onesimus depended on his wisdom to survive. His story forces us to confront a larger truth, that African knowledge, culture, and science have always been central to the human story, even when they are silenced. And so, when we roll up our sleeves today for vaccines, whether for smallpox, polio, or COVID-19, we are living in the long shadow of Onesimus. Every needle carries a trace of his legacy. Every life saved echoes the knowledge he shared. Onesimus was called useful by those who enslaved him. But history shows us he was more than useful. He was vital. His voice crossed oceans, survived chains, and helped change the course of medicine forever. Perhaps that is the lesson we take with us, that the past is never as simple as we are told, that greatness can come from the most unlikely and overlooked places, and that remembering names like Onesimus is not just about correcting the record. It's about reshaping how we see ourselves and our shared history. Because in the end, the fight against smallpox was not just about survival. It was about whose knowledge we trust, whose voices we honor, and whose stories we choose to remember. And today, finally, we remember Onesimus,